حبك بيض الله قلبك بيض الله قلبك كن سامحا لخصمك ألقى خصمك أحبك بيض الله قلبك بيض الله قلبك واحتفل بالمودة إنما
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Ahlan wa sahlan wa marhaban bikum. Welcome to another edition of the Sulaimaan Ravat Show. Now, recently I was browsing through my WhatsApp and I saw a link to a lecture that took place at the masjid in Westville, and the person had captioned it, "Must listen." And when I saw the name, it was the name of someone that I knew and someone I was familiar with. And I thought, well, okay, this is something that I definitely need to listen to. One is because I'm familiar with the person concerned, and the other was the topic about the fourth industrial revolution and where we are positioned as an ummah and what we need to take into cognizance in that regard really appealed to me. And once I had listened to the talk, immediately in my mind I said that we need to have the individual concerned in studio, and we need to share this message with a much broader audience. It's so relevant, it's so pertinent. The issues raised across that half an hour Jummah talk, some of those issues can become and should become independent discussions all on their own. But just to bring things into a context, to paint a bit of a broad picture is always a good starting point. And after that, you can look at the relevant pivotal points within that discussion and branch off into independent discussions in that regard. Now, the person that I'm referring to is the acting CEO currently of Transnet, and that is Brother Moulana Sulaimaan Ravat, who joins us this evening in the studios here at our headquarters in Sunny Hill, Johannesburg. Muhammad, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and welcome to the program.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, Moulana. Jazakumullah khair for the opportunity.
From the CEO's chair to the Jummah Mimbar, easy transition?
No, not so easy. I think the Jummah Mimbar is a lot more intimidating than the CEO's chair.
Subhanallah. Now you know why the Moulana is always in a bad mood Friday morning.
Yeah, I can understand that. It's a very difficult and intimidating task.
Many people would be familiar with your name, your title. You've been with Transnet for quite some time, but recently you were appointed acting CEO. You were also on the screens in many people's offices and homes when you were giving testimony at the Commission of Inquiry into State Capture. But tell us more about yourself. All started in Verulam?
Yeah, Alhamdulillah, Moulana. I spent my childhood in Verulam, a small town in the north coast of KwaZulu-Natal. Studied and educated myself in Verulam. I completed my articles of clerkship many years ago in an accounting firm in Durban. Married, spent some time in London for a little while in 1997 after I completed my the passing of the board exams. And then in about 2001, I joined Eskom. And I jokingly always say that it was in the glory days of Eskom, when we didn't have rolling blackouts. That was in 2001 to about 2004. I joined Transnet when it was still called Spoornet at the time. And that was in 2004. I spent about 2.5 years there, and then I left to actually go into private sector for a little while. And then back in Transnet in 2008. So for the last 10, 11 years I've been in Transnet, a total of about 13 years at Transnet. I've been across many of the divisions. I spent some time in Freight Rail, which is the biggest division. And then I was the CFO of the Group Capital area, which is a division involved in the infrastructure build at Transnet. And then in May 2018, I was asked to be the acting Chief Financial Officer at the time. And I spent about a year there. And then on the 1st of May this year, I was asked to act as the Chief Executive Officer of Transnet. Alhamdulillah.
Alhamdulillah, alhamdulillah. A little later in the program, I'll get back to the role of Muslims in this kind of an environment. But to get going with the topic, how did that come into play? This particular topic about the fourth industrial revolution that everyone talks about, and I think up front you mentioned in the talk that we need to start focusing on the fifth. How did that come into play? What led to it becoming a Jummah talk?
I think, largely what was happening was I had been reflecting a lot on where the Ummah was, particularly as we look at the state-owned entities and Muslims and the role that we play in some of the big organizations. Now, alhamdulillah, when we look at it, in some institutions, private sector, we have at the helm of and the captains of industry, we have Muslims who are excelling and doing very well. But it's a minority from our ummah. If we look at the global perspective, it's a minority. The question that kept me awake was when the fourth industrial revolution came upon us, as it is, we are in the midst of it. We are not at the beginning of it. We're in the midst of a fourth industrial revolution. The question is how many Muslims are at the cusp of technology today? Yeah. And that began to, create some debate in my mind around whether as a ummah we are ready for the fifth industrial revolution. Now, when we talk about the fifth industrial revolution, people look at us as though we are talking about something that's far-fetched and something that's way in the horizon. When we look at the industrial revolutions as they occurred, and we go back, the printing press was in the 1400s. That was when it was first created, and there wasn't really a revolution around it. The first industrial revolution came around the steam engine, which was in the 18th century. Then you had, between the 18th century and the 21st century, in a period of 300 years, you had 4 industrial revolutions. And the last one that we had before this one, the third industrial revolution, was in the 60s. So it was just about 40 to 50 years ago when we talk about the creation of the processor, and we talk about man on the moon. Yeah. That's essentially when the third industrial revolution was effected. Between then and now, we're talking about 40 years. The question is, if that is as long as it's taken, 40 years, my perspective is that the fifth industrial revolution will be upon us a lot sooner. It won't be 40 years. Some say it will be upon us in the next 10 years. And the question is whether as an ummah we are ready, whether we are prepared, whether our youth are motivated enough to study the right things, to be considering the right topics, to be following their passion. So it was not just a thought that was fleeting. I think it goes back to a fair amount of my own experience as well in recent years.
If I can just, branch off for a second. Within your current work environment, how much do they talk about the fourth industrial revolution and preparing for the fifth industrial revolution? We'll come back to our core focus about the ummah and where we are and how to plan. But I'm saying broadly speaking, in the corporate space, in the business world, when you travel internationally, how much your focus is there on this topic?
So I think if you actually sit with industries that are technologically focused, the disruption that they are implementing at the moment in a variety of spaces, whether it be in the logistics environment or whether we talk about transport, it's now at a point where it's no longer science fiction, if I can put it to you like that. I'll give you an example, Moulana. If we take in Australia, they actually have implemented driverless trucks already in the mining industry. So from the mine to the rail siding, there's a truck that is unmanned, that's controlled through a control room, in our terms by remote control. All right. They are currently testing driverless trains. They are talking about, to us we talk about the electric car, but in the United States they talk about the autonomous vehicle. We also have heard that in Dubai they want to launch the driverless Uber vehicle by December this year. This is where technology is going. Now we can either embrace the technology, we can be ready, we can be the developers of that technology, or we can just be plain users of technology. And I think that if you look at the fifth industrial revolution, they say, some analysts say it's already here in the space of artificial intelligence. Now, artificial intelligence is something that sometimes gets, I think there's a misnomer around it. And people think that when we talk of a robot, we're talking of a robot that in years ago brought tea and delivered tea, or helped in a household chore. That's the understanding that we may have. Today we're talking about artificial intelligence in one of the automotive businesses across the world, where they, at their head offices, have actually launched a robot that sits next to a human being and does the work that the human being does. Wow. This is the intelligence that is already built into that being. Whether we want to call it a being or not is a different debate, but into that being, where the being will sit next to a human being and conduct its work as the human being would conduct its work. If we look at the fourth industrial revolution and talk about Facebook and Google, these are not, today we take that as granted. We take that as being part of life, but yet 10 years ago it wasn't here. If you take the internet and you take email systems, I mean, today we talk about the Internet of Things, right? IoT. It's not the internet that we use, it's the internet that industry uses. And the internet that they use, for example, in power generation in the United States, would be looking at the Internet of Things, would be look at weather patterns and how we produce electricity in light of future weather patterns. And when we talk about future, we're talking about in the next hour, in the next 3 hours, in the next 5 hours. Whether there's a cold front that's going to hit a particular part of the country and therefore requires additional power generation. That's the technology that we're talking about, which previously was not necessarily utilized at that level. It may have existed. It may have existed. The data may have existed. But whether it was appropriately mined and whether it actually was utilized for different purposes, that may not. That is what is fundamentally changing.
So the pace is going to be much quicker moving from the fourth to the fifth industrial revolution. I think the common example we hear is about that the landing on the moon and the kind of technology and processing speed, I mean, compared to where we are here a couple of decades later is like in some ways laughable when you think about the kind of computer software that was utilized at that time. But in order for us to adequately prepare for the fifth industrial revolution, I suppose to some extent we have to analyze how did we embrace the fourth and how well did we do with the coming of the fourth. What's your take in that regard?
I think the key question that I always ask is whether we had a plan to get here as an ummah. Now, we can break this down to the individual, the family unit, and the collective ummah. So whether it's a community or the multiple communities that make up the ummah. The question that I have is, did we get there by design or by default? And the reason I use this is because we tend to say that when we achieve something, we say it's my doing. And I say this again with respect, because when we find that there's a trial and tribulation that comes in between something, then we say it's taqdeer.
Yes.
And my perspective is that we have to, as individuals first, have a plan. We have to strategize. We have to think about the future. We cannot sit back and say that everything will be by the will of Allah without us actually thinking about what is it we want to do tomorrow. And we can't also, in my view, say, well, Allah will plan everything for us. It's the trust in Allah concept, but tie your camel. And make an effort to think about what it is that you want to do. And where do you want to be? We all are fully aware that everything is in Allah's hands. We are 100% in that space. We understand that. But does that mean that because we leave everything in Allah's hands, we don't go to work or we don't make an effort? You know, what baffles me is that we tend to use that selectively. When it comes to the material world and our workspace and our finances, etc., we make every effort that's needed. But when it comes to certain other aspects, we say, no, that's in Allah's hands. Or it happened because Allah willed that. That may absolutely be the case. But again, I use the example of a man who goes to sleep and he says, well, maybe tomorrow I'll drive to Durban. And the other individual sits down and he says, no, tomorrow I am going to Durban. So he goes out and he checks whether he has enough fuel and whether his car is worthy to be driven. and he makes arrangements to leave, and he gets to Durban. It will take him the average of, whether dependent on your speed, but it will take you your average of 5.5, 6 hours to get to Durban.
Yeah.
The other individual may get to Durban, but it may take him 25 hours because he gets up in the morning and then checks, oh, I need a spare tire, so I need to go buy a tire. And by the way, I haven't filled up fuel, and I need to fill up fuel. And I forgot to tell my family that I was thinking of going to Durban. Mm-hmm. He will get to Durban. So his will is that he will get to Durban. But the problem is that he takes far longer because he hasn't had a plan. He hasn't thought about it. He hasn't strategized about it. So the question is whether as an ummah, we are looking at this change and being shocked by it because we are just the users of the technology. We're not the developers of the technology, and neither are we sitting back and thinking about or having thought about it a while ago to say that this technology is going to come upon us. Digital technology 10 years ago was not as complicated as it is today, but yet so simple to actually use, as an example. So it is about whether we're getting to a point as a result of having a design, a plan, a roadmap to get there, or we are going to get there by default, some say divine default, whichever way it is, but get there. You may get to the same point, but one gets there more efficiently. One gets there quicker. The same goes with the concept of rozi and risk. You may earn exactly the same amount of money that was always destined for you, but depends on how Allah wishes for you to get it. You could get it. One alim always used the concept of saying that you could get the tasbih. If your rozi was the tasbih, you could get the entire thing in your hand, or Allah could snip the string and get strewn all over, and you need to run and get it from everywhere.
Yeah, I think this is such a key point because Islam does not advocate being passive. You got to be active. One is the power of Allah, that irrespective of all your planning and your efforts, Allah can decree and make it happen otherwise. But the other is the system of Allah. They talk in theology, or Islamic theology, about Qudratullah and Sunnatullah, the power of Allah and the system of Allah. And the system of Allah is that you go out, you make an effort, you plan, and that is entrenched in the seerah of Nabi Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. Although we have no guarantee of whether we'll wake up tomorrow morning, but you've got to plan as if you're going to live for a very long time. And after that, what Allah decrees, we all believe in, and we will all be content with it at that particular time. And the other aspect also, in Arabic they say, مَنْ لَمْ يَعْرِفْ أَهْلَ زَمَانِهِ فَهُوَ جَاهِلٌ, that the epitome of ignorance is not to be up to date with the trends of the time. Because the glory days of Islam was when we were ahead of the curve. And that creates independence. And when you're not ahead of the curve, then you have all these big dreams of where the ummah should be, but you're totally dependent in terms of resources and technology and everything else on the very people who don't want to see the progress of Islam.
Yeah, so I think, the concept of having a dream without a plan is a hallucination.
Yeah.
Because it's going to take you nowhere. You can have the best of dreams, but if there's no plan attached to that and there's no real decisiveness behind that, we're going nowhere. If we look at, again, to the point of planning, I always use the example from an Islamic perspective. When the Prophet ﷺ was at the Battle of Uhud, they sat there and planned. He strategized around the archers that had to cover the valley. He didn't say that I made dua last night and therefore I know that we will be victorious. So even the Battle of Badr. And there was a plan, there was a strategy. They sat and they thought. But at the same time, the Prophet of Allah ﷺ also took the mashwara of those that may have been better than him in some aspect, and not as a creation, but rather in the Battle of Trench, for example, he took the advice of Salman al-Farsi. These are the principles that are entrenched in leadership today. These are the principles that are entrenched in some of the private sector entities that are successful. They actually use our principles and we don't use them. So as a community and as an ummah, I think the question is, have we dreamt and thought about the next revolution that's coming? And whether our generations that are coming along have been appropriately equipped and tasked and skilled in the particular environments that they may excel in. The days of us sitting back and having or being very happy with our children becoming doctors and lawyers and accountants, I think are over.
Yeah.
And I think, even if you look at 2022, which is 3 years away, the World Economic Foundation just a few days ago launched what they believe the top 10 jobs will be, and what the top 10 jobs that will be in decline are going to be. So if you take the top 10 jobs that we talk about, they talk about data mining experts, data scientists. These are concepts that didn't exist 10 years ago. These are concepts that didn't exist 5 years ago. Forget 10 years ago, 5 years ago. Cybersecurity. Today, cybersecurity is probably amongst the single biggest risks that any company faces on the planet. Any company. And every single government is concerned about cybersecurity today.
Yeah.
Nothing more than that. That's their number one risk. Cybersecurity wasn't even a conversation 10 years ago.
Correct.
So the question that we have to keep asking ourselves is, are we ready? Are we ready from a multitude of perspectives? Not just, are we ready as an ummah? Are we ready as the individuals? Are our youth ready? Are they thinking about becoming software engineers? Are they thinking about civil engineering? Now, one of the questions you asked earlier on around the fifth industrial revolution. I'll give you an example. If you take the building industry, previously it used to be two-dimensional drawings that were put out on tables.
Yeah.
And the builders would sit and measure and would come up to scale and say, well, this wall has to be 2 meters and this it's got to be by 3 meters. I visited a factory in the United Kingdom where the plans are in what they call 5 dimension. Right? On a memory stick, it's all done and dusted, literally. The memory stick is taken and given to a company, Rock and Lang, as an example. They build the entire wall in their factory. They build that wall in a factory. That wall, together with all of the different parts of that building, are built off-site, put onto a truck, taken to the site, and similar to the concept of Lego, fitted together on site. And a building is built. They built a bridge in 5 days.
Wow.
Put a bridge together in 5 days. I've seen the building taking place, where the disc is given and it starts. It cuts the steel, it pours the cement, it seals it off. I'll add one more thing. It even paints the building. So the wall, if you wanted to put wallpaper, the wallpaper is already attached. If you look at a company called Broad Construction in China, they've built a 30-story hotel in 15 days.
Wow.
30 stories in 15 days. That can stand a 9 magnitude earthquake. So we're not talking about, and when I say built it, it's a hotel that's ready for occupation, ready for use, with the plumbing, with the electrical, with the curtains all in, and the beds. 30 stories in 15 days. Their target now is to build a tower, 90-story tower in 30 days. That's their target. But it's using the concept of robotics. The company that I referenced in the United Kingdom was one of the biggest recruiters of the motor industry people that were being let off when the automotive sector had declined in the UK. They went and hired all of the robotics engineers from the automotive sector and then used them to build this technology. And this massive plant is, I think they have about 300 people working there. The rest of it is done by robots. And it's already been, it's been in operation now for probably, I think, minimum the last 5 years.
Wow. We'll take a quick break. When we come back, inshallah, we continue this very fascinating and interesting discussion. Welcome back. So our guest in studio this evening is Moulana Sulaimaan Mohammadi. He is the acting CEO at Transnet, and we're talking about, call it the fifth industrial revolution that we need to prepare for. And the question is, are we ready as an ummah? You know, normally we hear this example of Nokia. 10 years ago, Nokia was the phone to have. And if you were sitting around a braai stand, every other person would have a Nokia. And then Nokia became complacent and BlackBerry came and took over. And the in thing was everybody had a BlackBerry. I remember going for Hajj in 2009, and I actually was looking around the Haram, and you would literally see almost everyone was moving with a BlackBerry. And then BlackBerry became complacent, and it was iPhone and Samsung and Huawei and whatever else. And today, even the budgies don't want to be seen with a Nokia. And whilst BlackBerry was a very cool thing, no youngster today uses a BlackBerry. So the time periods have become so short. You always have to be thinking ahead. You always have to be ahead of the curve. And we spoke at length about how quick things are moving these days. Now, you touched on a key aspect, the youth. What message do you have for the youth in particular, and for the current generation who are basically helping the youth and guiding them and managing their progress and their career choices and that kind of thing? Many of them seem to be just floating directionlessly. It's all about the gadgets and all of those kind of things, but no real vision in terms of what they want to do.
So I think, Moulana, the key thing, as I said, is that right now we seem to be only the users of technology. We are not sitting in the space. There are certain places where some of our ummah is involved in becoming developers of technology, and alhamdulillah, they're doing fantastically well. But the large bulk of our youth are users, whether it be Instagram or the social media platforms. That's all they are concerned about. The key issue is whether our youth are motivated enough and whether they have actually contemplated where they need to play, which space they need to be in, as individuals and collectively as well. And what I'm referencing there is basically, what is the purpose and passion of the individual? Again, I go back to the concept of where parents sometimes also, I think, need to, for want of a better phrase, catch a wake-up call in making sure that our children go and pursue their passion and they find their calling, rather than pursue what I want them to do, what I think is a safe bet for them. And the reason I say this is because we talk to certain the youth that come out of universities after they have qualified, and when you ask them what their area of speciality will be, they say they haven't figured it out yet. Now that's a very frightening, and this is not necessarily related to any particular area or any particular race or any particular ethnicity. It's actually a problem that's pervasive to the youth across all of the sectors in our community, whether it be in the white, black, Indian, any area. You find that this is one area that's a problem. But you know, you have to sit down and ask a question. When will you know what you actually want to pursue? What is that passion? Because you've got to do this for the next 30 years, 40 years of your life. And if you're not sure of it, and you have gone and you've studied something. I mean, I know of a case where a person went and studied and became a doctor. After 7 years, he said, this is not what I wanted. And he then went and did a business degree. Now, that's clearly where we, as parents, also need to play a part in our children's lives, to make sure that they are guided correctly, that they are directed, that they are asked those difficult questions before we send them to university. Is this really what you want to do? Is this what your passion was? Have you gone to see a psychologist who actually assesses? And when we talk psychologists, sometimes a lot of our parents go into a very negative frame. Oh, and there's nothing wrong with my child. No, there's nothing wrong with your child. But there are psychologists who today specialize in determining what your key competencies are, your innate competencies. Yeah. And we need to test those. We need to understand what those competencies are of our children before we can put them into the lion's den per se. It's difficult when a person qualifies and then sits there thinking, I don't want to do this for the rest of my life, but has to.
Yeah, because now you're like on you feel guilty. Your father spent so much of money and you've gone through the entire process. In the Jummah talk, you also speak, quite eloquently about elements of leadership that we need to consider very seriously if we are to embrace the fifth industrial revolution in an adequate way.
I was fortunate, alhamdulillah, to attend a business school through Transnet. And the entire 3 weeks was labeled Advanced Strategic Management. And I prepared myself to go there and be taught things around strategy and how to look forward and put those things into practice. What I was astounded was that approximately 55% of that program was actually self-awareness and self-development. And that is something that we don't spend enough time talking about in our homes. That is something we sweep under the carpet in our communities. This is not something that receives attention. Now, why I say that is because as we look at the leadership quotient or the leadership model that used to exist in the past, if we go back 30, 40 years, the cleverest person was who got the job. That was the attention.
IQ, yeah.
That was what it was about. It was about IQ. Then a few years back, they started talking about EQ and emotional intelligence. And they said, well, without the EQ and having the IQ without the EQ didn't make you a good leader. They didn't talk about a boss. They talk about a leader.
Yeah.
And today, the leadership model talks about SQ and then talks about PQ. So it talks about your physical awareness and it talks about your spiritual awareness. Now, as Muslims, we shouldn't have a problem with spiritual quotient because we have the 5 daily salah, we have our hajj, we have our umrah, we have our spiritual connection with Allah. We should be grounded. And when you look at leadership, it encompasses all of these. It's not saying that you've got to be very bright and therefore you'll be a good leader. In fact, the opposite is true. When you look at the model that exists currently in the apex of management, we talk about the person that is at the top of an organization. Previously, if you were in an engineering organization, you needed a very strong engineer to run that organization. Today, that's not the case. As you go higher up in an organization, your EQ becomes less important. I'm not saying that it's not relevant, because as you climb the ladder of growth in an entity, you start with having the need for a good IQ. But as you go up the organization, your competency is on the EQ, not on the IQ. And that today is where entities are looking. They're actually testing. When you go in for an interview at a chief executive level or a chief financial officer level, they don't really ask you technical questions about accounting because it's not about the functional aspect. It's about whether you're going to have the ability to actually interact with people, get the right decisions, have the right stakeholder engagement, which is all about relationships and people and emotional intelligence. And that, I believe, is not receiving the necessary attention in the ummah. And we have a leadership deficit, not necessarily just in the ummah, but I think we have a leadership deficit in a number of spaces that we look at. But as an ummah, I think it's something we have to look at improving. We need to have a lot more leaders, whether it be in the accounting space or the auditing space or in the ulama space, whether it be a mufti or medical doctor. If the mufti is a good leader, he'll be able to lead a lot more people. The concept of leadership is sometimes a misnomer as it's aligned to management or being a boss or being an owner of a business. And that also, for me, is a problem in our community because we are a community largely of business people. Then we tend to, in our own businesses, understand or misunderstand that because I inherited this business, I'm the leader. Actually, you just the owner. A leader of the business could be fundamentally different to ownership. And therefore, I think leadership is something we need to build, whether it be in our businesses, whether it be in our homes, whether it be amongst the ulama circle or the professional circle. Because as you get into organizations and you see, and you discuss at a higher level of management, you find there's less and less of the ummah present.
No, for sure. And I think that that point you make also about IQ versus EQ, we see it in the ulama fraternity as well. It's not necessarily the one who got the best marks in class who becomes the best imam or who becomes the best teacher. Because your textual knowledge may have been stronger, but if you don't have that ability to interact with the congregation, to develop a rapport with the youth, to connect with the child in the classroom, then you're better suited to in some academic pursuit and not in certain environments. Do we even discuss these things? I think is a question we need to ask. I mean, if we look at the ordinary kind of social interaction or chit-chat that takes place in the Muslim community, something like this would be seemingly odd. This is too deep. Where is this person coming now? With these kind of things, and perhaps that's a good starting point. We need to talk more about it so that we can have more action in relation to it.
I think that's one of the big problems. We don't talk enough about it, and we tend to want to not talk about these things because they are foreign to us. Yet, if we go into the seerah of Nabi Kareem Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, he was one of the greatest, he is the greatest leader of all times. Now, when you look at the definition of leadership, depends which textbook you use, there's a multitude of them, but amongst them, one of them says that the leader must leave a legacy. The second, the leader must have followers. Now, when you look at Nabi Kareem Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam and you ask the question, was he a leader? Why are we not talking about those qualities of Nabi Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam? And the fact that today you have over 1 billion people that follow somebody from 1400 years ago, which is unparalleled as from a leadership perspective. We talk about the emotional quotient. The Prophet of Allah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam would sit with a Bedouin and he would sit with a nobleman. That is EQ.
100%.
Now we can go on and give multitude of examples about Nabi Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam's variety of skills from a leadership perspective. Today they tell you that one of the critical requirements of leadership is collaborative thinking, right? Which is consultative democracy, which is mashwara, right? Which is sitting down and listening to people and getting a view from what you've heard, not what you've thought about. Today, the person that sits at the helm of an organization thinks, I have all of the answers. And therefore, and I've been put here because of my IQ and because of my years of experience. And for me, that is a fallacy. You do not have all the answers. You cannot have all the answers. No one individual can be strong in every single facet of a business, financial, technical, engineering, accounting, whatever it may be. You cannot have all of the skills. And therefore, you need to have people that you can surround yourself with, your immediate shura, right? And so none of this exists outside of our deen. And that's what fascinated me when I began to unravel, if I can call it that, the leadership model. None of it sits outside of deen. None of it sits outside of the seerah of Nabi Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. So the critical issue is for us to commence the conversations. As I said to a sister the other day, a niece of mine, because she said that the problem I have is that people are going to look at me and say, why am I doing this? And I said, yes, they will turn on and tell you that. And some will even say, you've lost it. Some will even say, well, this is now the in thing. To be a leader, the most important thing that they teach you is to be self-aware, to develop yourself. So the concept of tasawwuf comes in. Right? For us to constantly be aware of what I do, whether it's right, whether it's wrong. And that doesn't mean that you're self-aware to the point where you think everything's right. Self-awareness is reflection. Talks about whether you have done something, you could have done something better. So that's the first thing, which is my view on leadership is not necessarily receiving the discussion that it should be receiving in our circles, whether it be from the mimbar or whether it be around the conversations that we have around the dinner table.
We'll take another quick break. When we come back, inshallah, we're going to wrap up this very fascinating and enlightening discussion, thought-provoking discussion with Muhammad Mohammadi. Welcome back. Our guest in studio this evening, Moulana Sulaimaan Mohammadi. He is the acting CEO at Transnet. He gave a talk recently at the Westfield Masjid, and he spoke about the move from the fourth to the fifth industrial revolution, and he's asking the burning question, are we ready as an ummah? Have we understood what is happening in the environment within which we exist? Moment earlier on, I said I was going to come back to a point, and I mean, you're working in a very interesting space, in a very dynamic space, in a very important space. If you look at it specifically in the context of the Muslim community in South Africa, I hear this lament, if you like, this complaint all the time that there aren't that many or adequate number of Muslims in civil service, in working in state-owned entities, in the political space. You in that space, do you share that concern?
I think somewhat we share the concern, particularly in the professional space. When we look at, if you go back historically and we analyze, there seems to be a view from within our community to take certain preferences in studying. If we go back many years, or you go back 25, 30 years, then the BA was the degree everybody studied. And then a few years later, you look at the BCom being very common. So there seems to be common cause that we have within our youth when they study. And it's not something that's relevant to today's youth. It's relevant, I think, to a number of generations, in my view. We did not go and study across the broad spectrum of degrees that were available to us, whether we talk about engineering. So today when we look at it, the requirement for the need for engineers, we don't have the right number of engineers available to us, because most of us at the time studied accounting, as an example. Going forward, the question is, what should we be studying? What are those things that we should be looking at? But again, it goes to the principle, Moulana, of purpose.
Yeah.
We shouldn't be studying because my friend is studying engineering, or my friend is doing commerce, or somebody told me this is where I should be. It's what is it from you, from within your heart? Where do you find that actual space where you find you in the arc, if I can call it that, where you're enjoying that subject or that interaction with somebody. Somebody wants to be a psychologist because they love helping people solve problems. Somebody needs to be a really good IT specialist. Not, the days of being a generalist are over. You need to be a specialist. And I talk about having a degree and becoming a data scientist and a data engineer, which is what the world will need in the next 5 to 10 years. So it's about us making sure we have the right qualifications. My assessment is that we don't currently. When you look at most of the environments and the organizations that exist today, it's difficult to find our brothers and sisters that are excelling in a particular space for two particular reasons, in my view. One is that we have taken mediocrity on as a full-time job. and I say this with respect because we have limited ourselves in what we deliver. We have the ability. Allah has given us the ability. This is not a man-made ability. This is an Allah-given quality. We have the ability, and it is, I believe, an amanat to us to actually act in the best interest of ourselves and do the best and be the best. So when we encounter some of our colleagues and our brothers and sisters out there, they lack confidence. And this is also something that I feel strongly about. The discussion about confidence versus humility versus arrogance. And there's a fine line between confidence and arrogance. But I think that confidence is necessary. It's something that when you walk into a room, you're confident of your ability and your understanding of a particular subject. It doesn't mean that you are arrogant to the state that you know it all. You can't know it all. Nobody can know it all. But I think that the reality is that we have to start breeding more confident youth. We have to start breeding youth that are taking the view that I will do the best that I can be, not just be good. I said that good is not good enough anymore.
Yeah, it reminds me of an incident I read somewhere that when Muawiyah radiyallahu anhu was a kid, he fell and he started crying. So the servant told him, "La tabki ya Sayyid al-Arab," that don't cry, O the leader of the Arabs, because his father was the leader of the Quraysh. And the mother rebuked the servant, saying, "Don't address my son as the leader of the Arabs, address him as the leader of the Arabs and the non-Arabs." And that became his destiny. For 20 years, he was the ruler. And another, just as you were talking, another hadith came to mind where Anas radiallahu anh mentioned that Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam said that if you are busy planting a tree and the announcement is made that Qiyamah is to take place, finish what you're doing, then embrace Qiyamah. So it ties up with what you were saying, that have a sense of purpose. We know that the real life is the life of the akhirah, but I think many times the way we misunderstand things is we think that this dunya stands condemned. It doesn't. Making the dunya your sole objective, that is what stands condemned. But the dunya is so important and valuable because that becomes the vehicle that determines your outcome in the akhirah. So Islam wants us to be active, active citizens, active humans, active Muslims, use our faith to derive a sense of greater purpose and use whatever we need to use in this world to make the best of our existence in this world and to make the best of the opportunities, not only individually, but in terms of the country and in terms of the ummah. We have about a minute or so left. Just a concluding thought that you want to wrap up?
I think the one thing that we must all strive for is being the best at what we can be. We must be confident in our own abilities and the abilities that Allah has granted us. But we must also always remember that regardless of where you are, whether you're a professional, a doctor, a lawyer, an accountant, a data scientist, or somebody, think about what you can do for the ummah, what you can do for the deen of Allah. And when I say that, I use the example, I know there's a lot of debate about an actuarial scientist, for example. But how can an actuarial scientist help us develop? I use the example of developing a medical aid that is permissible in deen, or developing an investment scheme that's permissible in deen. So using your Allah-given capability for deen, for the ummah, for the upliftment of the person next door to you on either side. I think we have to also remember that in the corporate world, we have to always be good Muslims, because da'wah is also not necessarily only given door to door. It is about how you are seen by the individual that sits across the table from you. And that can never be forgotten.
Jazakumullah so much for your time. There's so much more that we could have discussed and we need to discuss perhaps at another time. But may Allah Ta'ala put the realization of what you're saying into the hearts of one and all, inshallah.
Jazakumullah khair, Moulana.
Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
To the viewers, until next week, fi amanillah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
جميل المساعي وامنح الناس حب